Welcome to Module 7. We are on our second to last system of Biology 216, and we are going to be talking about the urinary system this week. This is our last excretory system. The urinary system can be very complex, and so I'm going to break up this week into 4 mini lectures. In this first lecture, we're going to talk about the macroanatomy or the large scale anatomy. As we go into the kidney, the anatomy becomes very minuscule and microscopic, and that's where students struggle. And so that will be mainly in the second lecture. But in this first lecture, we're just going to focus on kind of the larger scale anatomy here. Okay, so the urinary system is made up of 2 kidneys, 2 ureters, a urinary bladder, and a urethra. So here are your kidneys. They're little bean-shaped structures. Off of each kidney, we have a long tube called a ureter that drains urine from the kidney down into the urinary bladder where urine is stored. And then a urethra would be our exit tube out. So urine is formed in the kidney, travels down the ureter, stored in the bladder, and then excreted through the urethra. Major functions of the kidneys. Okay, so fluid maintenance and volume. So we talked a lot about the cardiovascular system. And if you can recall, I said that a lot of the blood pressure maintenance and homeostasis and fluid volume of the body will also be attributed to the kidneys. So we're going to get into that quite a bit. Also maintaining body fluid pH. And so the pH of the body so far we've talked about being responsible from the respiratory system. But the kidneys actually play a role in that by excreting hydrogen ions, excess hydrogen ions to maintain the pH of our body fluid. We're going to get into the blood pressure maintenance in that renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system that I think I barely introduced in the cardiovascular, but we're going to hit that hard. Waste removal, obviously, so a lot of filtration occurring in the kidneys. Up until this point, we've talked about a lot of filtration being through the liver. But this time we're going to talk about the kidneys. And then don't forget these kind of less major functions. Erythropoietin. Remember, erythropoietin from blood is the hormone that stimulates red blood cell production in the bone marrow, and that's released by the kidneys. And then also the kidneys absorb a lot of calcium, and calcium is necessary for vitamin D as well. So those are just our kind of overview functions of the kidneys. These first 3 we're going to hit on mostly. So when you look at the kidney, it looks like this bean-shaped structure. Now, the kidneys situated in the body are retroperitoneal. And what retroperitoneal means is that they actually sit attached to the posterior abdominal wall, and they actually kind of sit in line with the spine. So they are very posterior. And in dissection, if you've ever had the opportunity to dissect a human cadaver, they're actually hidden. You have to know that you're looking for them. You kind of have to palpate the area back there because they're covered by a really thick layer of connective tissue and fat. And so you kind of have to uncover them, kind of unbury them in order to get them out. Which kidney is lower? So here in this picture, the right kidney sits lower. Reason, the liver sits right here. So the liver is a very large organ. So it's sitting here. There's not enough room for that kidney to come up. So that right kidney is going to sit just a little bit lower than the left. The kidney is surrounded by a renal capsule, which is kind of a thin layer here of outer tissue, fibrous tissue. And fat. So again, in dissection, when you pull that kidney out, it's covered in a layer of fat and then kind of like a sac. That's going to be the renal capsule. It's bean-shaped. It has a hilum. And if you can recall that term from respiratory system, the hilum is where things enter and exit here. And so we've got blood vessels entering and exiting, as well as that ureter entering and exiting. So the hilum is always a point of entry for usually blood vessels and other things like that, other tubes. Oops. Okay. Now, if we do a sagittal cut of the kidney, so we've cut it in half and we're looking on the inside, we have a cortex, a medulla, and sinuses. So the cortex and the medulla, if you can recall from other organs we've talked about this semester, the cortex is always the outer and the medulla is the inner. And when we talk about the kidney, The cortex is going to be out here where you see all these little spidery looking vessels. We're going to name those here in just a little bit. This is all cortex out here, outer edge. The medulla is going to include all of these like fan-shaped structures, which we will name here in just a minute as well. So this is going to be medulla. This is cortex, medulla. And then we have renal sinuses sitting in these areas, just below those fans, in between them, filled with fat. Those are going to be your renal sinuses. Okay, I apologize. There's just some technical difficulties with my camera. Okay, so again, cortex, medulla, sinuses in between here filled with fatty tissue. And then we're going to jump into this a little bit further. And within that cortex, we're going to have things called nephrons, and you can't see them from this macro anatomy. This is why we're not going to hit on this until lecture 2. But if we zoomed in on these little guys out here, we would see this really complex network of yellow stuff in here. That's going to be where the nephrons are located. And those nephrons are where the magic happens. That is how our urine begins to be formed. So we're going to get to that in lecture 2. But in the cortex out here, we've got nephrons. In the renal medulla area, each of these fan structures is called a pyramid. Between those pyramids, the structure or the tissue that sits between the pyramids in the medulla is called the renal columns. So the columns are going to be these areas. Sinuses are going to be down here a little bit further, but the columns are going to be here, pyramids here. And then at the bottom of each pyramid right here is a papilla. So that's just the bottom of a pyramid. Now notice how all of these pyramids have a tube attached to them right here. Okay. Those tubes are called minor calyces, calyx for short, okay, or for singular. Okay, so at the bottom of each pyramid, we have a papilla where it meets our minor calyx. Multiple minor calyces are going to merge into what we call a major calyx. And so this is a good example up here. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 minor calyces merging into a major calyx area. It's kind of like a tree branching here. It's just a bigger branch than these little ones here. So this is a major calyx. And this is all tubular. So if we were to actually look in this kidney, it would not look open like this. It would be a bunch of tubes, kind of like with the bronchial tree with the lungs. And then all of those major calyces drain into this area, which is called the renal pelvis. So all of those are going to drain into this renal pelvis, and look where the renal pelvis connects to. It exits via a ureter. So you can imagine that somehow urine is traveling through here, ending up in these calyce networks in the pelvis, and then draining out the ureter. So that's the pathway of urine. The pathway of urine basically goes from cortex to pelvis. Blood is filtered, and that is how urine is made. And so the blood network is going to go into the cortex and then out of the cortex. And as the venous system exits the kidney, the urine will also exit the kidney, but it'll do so through this more tubular pathway. And then out the ureter. So there's 2 types of pathways here that we're talking about. There's going to be a tubular pathway and there's going to be a vascular pathway. So we're going to keep those 2 things straight as we go forward here. Let's talk about the vascular pathway first. So renal arteries. So remember, the kidneys are an organ. They need to be kept alive. They need oxygen. So they need oxygenated blood from an artery. Now, the renal artery, renal means kidney, right? So renal arteries here that enter the hilum, those come from what major vessel? Remember, from the blood vessel section, we have renal arteries coming off the abdominal aorta. So from the abdominal aorta, we've got 2 renal arteries, 1 going to each kidney. Now we're going to go through a bunch of branching. Again, kind of like with the respiratory system, with the bronchial tree, we've got lots of branching, lots of dividing going on here. So bear with me. The area that this needs to get to, the goal of this oxygenated blood is going to be out here in the cortex. So we're going to move this direction out to the cortex. So our renal artery is going to divide into branches called segmental arteries. Those segmental arteries are going to branch into arteries called interlobar arteries. And those interlobar arteries are going to lie in that column space between the pyramids. Okay, so those are interlobar arteries. Then what's going to happen is those interlobar arteries are going to branch and arch over the top of each pyramid. And the arching vessel is called an arcuate artery. And then finally, we see those little spider-like looking structures, those little branches. Those are going to be called cortical radiate arteries. Cortical radiate spanning, right, radiating the cortex. Cortical radiate. After that, we do have more vessels that are itty bitty teeny tiny, but that's going to be in part 2 because that's going to be more microanatomy. That's going to be at the level of the nephron. And so this is just macroanatomy. So we're going to stop there until part 2. So that's the major arterial system. So from the abdominal aorta, right, then we go through a renal artery. Then we divide into segmental arteries here in the pelvis area. Those are going to split into interlobar arteries, which are going to lie on the renal columns between the pyramids. The interlobar arteries are going to divide and go over the top of the pyramids, which are going to be arcuate arteries. And then little branches off of the arcuate here are going to be your cortical radiate arteries. And then from there, we will go into part 2. Now, at that microscopic level where that nephron is, where those cortical radiate arteries are, that's where the magic happens. That's where the filtration happens. That's how we go from vascular pathway in to vascular and urinary pathway out. And so let's just follow the vascular pathway first. So our renal veins, right, they're going to empty eventually into the inferior vena cava. Remember that the renal veins are not part of the hepatic portal system. Why would the renal veins not need to go through the liver before going back to the heart? Because the kidney is doing its own filtration. Remember that the liver is for filtration of arteries from, or excuse me, veins from the intestines, the stomach, the spleen. But our kidneys are kind of their own little filter. They don't need to go through the liver. They're doing the work themselves. And so those are going to be directly into the inferior vena cava, which will then go back to the right atrium. Now, we're in here, right? This is where our capillary network is. So remember, we have to have a capillary between artery and vein. And then let's just work our way out. We'll zoom in on that in part 2. So we're at cortical radiate veins. Okay, so they're called the same thing, which makes it really easy. Cortical radiate veins, arcuate veins. We're working our way back out of the kidney. Cortical radiate veins, arcuate veins, interlobar veins. And then oddly enough, somebody thought that we didn't need any segmental veins. So you can see this interlobar actually goes all the way out. This interlobar goes all the way out. So we don't have any segmental veins. So I know that makes it complicated, but just try and remember that the venous system, the only one that is arterial but not venous would be those segmentals. And then finally into the renal vein, and then those renal veins will empty into the inferior vena cava. Okay, so we've gone in through the arterial system and out through the venous system. Your book has a nice diagram of what that looks like. So other macroanatomy that we need to talk about would be the ureters and the bladder. So we've kind of went through the kidney, we went through the blood supply of the kidney. Now, let's follow the tubular pathway of where urine is going to go, macro, at the large scale level here. So remember here, we've got our renal pelvis, which will end up going to the ureter. Remember, the pelvis arises from my major calyces and minor calyces here from the pyramids. Okay, so we have our ureters. They're about 25 centimeters long, and at their widest point, it's about 1.7 centimeters. So they are actually going to join the bladder posteriorly and inferiorly. So interestingly, the ureters go underneath the bladder and on the back of the bladder. People don't think about that or don't realize that the bladder actually fills from the bottom up. But it does. So, hang on one second. Okay, sorry about that. I had to go get the puppy. He woke up from his nap a little early. But ureters. Okay, so they're about 25 centimeters long. They fill the bladder from the posterior and inferior up. So the bladder actually fills from the bottom up. They are composed of some layers, smooth muscle, because they undergo peristalsis. And from the digestive system, peristalsis is that wave-like movement, that involuntary wave-like movement of something towards the next location. And so as these ureters stretch, when urine drains into them, a peristalsis wave will pull urine from the pelvis into the ureter and then down into the bladder. So as the stretches here where that pelvis becomes full, that peristalsis will take over and push that urine through the ureters to the bladder. Now, where those ureters enter the bladder from the inferior and posterior, there is a valve there. And so you're probably wondering why fill from the bottom up? Wouldn't that be problematic? Wouldn't the urine just go back down and then up the ureter and back up? Well, it doesn't. There's a little flap of tissue there where that ureter meets the bladder and it acts as a valve. So that valve opens to let urine into the bladder, but then that valve will close. And so urine cannot go back out of the bladder and backflow into the ureter. And when we get to, excuse me, the urinary bladder here, the bladder is a dome-like organ. It's very muscular, smooth muscle, so it's involuntary. It has rugae. So if you remember from the digestive tract, the rugae are the folds of tissue here in the bladder. It has something called transitional epithelium, which means that the cells look one shape when they are when the bladder is relaxed, but as the bladder fills, those cells kind of flatten out. And that triggers stretch receptors. And so as those cells flatten out and the bladder stretches, the stretch receptors are stimulated, and then urination can occur. We'll go into that more, I believe, in lecture 4. This area here where these ureters enter the bladder and then also the urethra here makes kind of a triangle pattern. This is called the trigon. So this is where the two ureters enter the bladder and urine fills up this way. And then the urethra opening here. So that's called the trigon. And then the muscular layer here in the bladder is called detrusor muscle. It is a smooth muscle, so it is involuntary. And then here at the very bottom of the bladder where urine will exit, we have an internal urethral sphincter. And kind of like with the anus of the digestive tract, there's an internal sphincter and an external sphincter. The internal sphincter you don't have control over, the external sphincter you do. And so this internal sphincter here is what causes kind of like the urge to urinate. And then you can relax your external sphincter in order to urinate. Let's see here. Okay, so here's the bladder in both sexes. The bladder, in the female sits here, male sits here. Notice you have your uterus over the top of the bladder. That's why when the baby grows here, pushes on your bladder, and women feel like they have to urinate all the time. Males, the bladder's here, and then here's the urethra here. Females, here's the bladder here and the urethra here. And so on the next slide, we're going to talk about the urethra and how much longer of a trek it is for the male reproductive system, urinary system, than it is for the female. So the urethra connects the bladder to the external body. So we have that involuntary internal sphincter and the voluntary external sphincter. And so in males, the bladder has the urethra here, and that actually passes through something called the prostate gland. We're going to talk more about the prostate gland when we get to reproductive system. So this section of the urethra is called the prostatic urethra. So from the bladder, we go through the prostatic urethra. Then we go through this little short area of the urethra from the prostate to the penis, and that is called the membranous urethra. And in the membranous urethra is where that external urethral sphincter is located. From there, we pass through the spongy urethra. The spongy urethra passes the length of the penis. Now, females are a little bit simpler in that we have just our urethra extending straight to the outside. Males, they have reproductive function and urinary function through the same tube, the same urethra. And so theirs is a little bit more complicated. Females, our urethras are 4 centimeters. And males are about 20. Because they have those 3 sections of the urethra. So they're about 20 centimeters in length. Females are only about 4. So which person is more likely to develop a UTI? Females, because it's shorter. Now the urethra sits very close to the anus, right? A lot of bacteria in that area. So when that bacteria creeps from the anus into the urethra and travels up into the bladder, then we have problems with risk of infection. So females are more likely to get a UTI because we have shorter urethras than males. Males, we have all of this distance that bacteria would have to travel. And like anything, there is a lymphatic system and some white blood cells and things in these areas to try and keep pathogens out before they get too far. All right. So that is our first lecture over the macroanatomy. In part 2, we will cover the nephron and zoom in on that glomerulus.